Richard Alcott stared out of the window of his sprawling Vermont mansion, the late autumn sun casting a pale golden hue over the frost-kissed hills. The once celebrated author had retreated to this solitude years ago after his wife's death, his fame overshadowed by grief and a profound sense of guilt. His daughter had tried to reach out before their relationship completely dissolved, but Richard, too consumed by his regrets, had shut her out. Now, he was alone with his memories, his mansion, and the ghosts of a life he could no longer touch. He walked back into his study, its bookshelves packed with novels he'd written decades ago and manuscripts that lay unfinished, gathering dust. It was his sanctuary, but also a reminder of how far he had drifted from the man he once was. The clutter, much like his thoughts, had grown uncontrollable. Perhaps that was why, after much hesitation, he had agreed to let his agent hire someone to help him sort through the mess. It wasn't a decision he was entirely comfortable with, but his health and declining patience had left him little choice. Margaret Hayes arrived one crisp Monday morning, stepping out of an old sedan with a modest suitcase and a quiet demeanor. She was in her mid-40s, with soft brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck and an air of calm that immediately struck Richard as unusual. She didn't fawn over his fame or appear intimidated by his curt nature. She simply offered him a polite smile, set her bag down near the doorway, and waited for instructions. "You'll be organizing the study," he said without preamble, his voice gruff from lack of use. "There's a filing cabinet for papers. The books stay where they are." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "Understood, Mr. Alcott. And keep out of anything that looks personal," he added, narrowing his eyes. "Your job is to organize, not to snoop." Her expression didn't change, though she met his gaze with quiet confidence. "I'll respect your privacy." The first few days passed without incident. Margaret worked diligently, sorting manuscripts, labeling stacks of paper, and cataloging the chaos into a manageable order. Richard watched her occasionally from the doorway, unsure whether to feel relief or irritation at her efficiency. She was quiet, almost invisible, but there was a warmth about her presence that seemed to seep into the room like sunlight through a crack in the curtains. She hummed softly while she worked, a habit Richard found both comforting and unnervingly personal. One afternoon, Richard ventured into town for errands, leaving Margaret alone in the house. She moved from the study to a nearby sitting room where she had found a stack of unopened boxes. She gently opened one, revealing a collection of old letters and photographs. Though she'd promised to respect Richard's privacy, the sight of the neatly folded letters stopped her in her tracks. They were addressed in a delicate, flowing script to "My dearest Richard" and signed simply with the initial E. Margaret ran her fingers over the faded ink, a pang of emotion stirring within her. She placed the letters back carefully, her thoughts lingering on the man upstairs, whose silence seemed to echo through the halls of his grand but lonely home. The following morning, Richard was unusually quiet at breakfast. He barely looked at Margaret as she brought him a cup of tea, his gaze fixed on the gray sky beyond the kitchen window. She wanted to say something, to bridge the vast chasm of silence that separated them, but her instincts told her to wait. Richard was a man of layers, and each one would take time to uncover. Later that day, Margaret decided to take a walk during her break. The fresh air was invigorating, and she found herself wandering further than she intended, drawn by the sound of children's laughter in the distance. She came upon a small park near a modest building with a hand-painted sign, "Evergreen Shelter for Children." Margaret's heart ached as she watched a group of children playing tag in the yard. Among them was a little girl, no older than 7, with dark curls framing a pale, delicate face. She wasn't running with the others, but sat on a bench, her knees drawn up to her chest, a wistful expression on her face. "Hello there," Margaret said gently as she approached, kneeling slightly to meet the girl's eye level. The child looked up, startled but curious. "Hi," the girl replied softly. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "Clara." "Well, Clara," Margaret said, smiling warmly, "it's a pleasure to meet you." "I'm Margaret." Clara didn't smile back, but there was a flicker of trust in her wide brown eyes. Margaret sat beside her on the bench, and the two began a quiet conversation that would unknowingly alter both of their lives. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Clara as she walked back to Richard's mansion that afternoon. The girl's quiet demeanor, her wide eyes that seemed to hold years of sadness, had left a mark on her heart. There was something about Clara that Margaret couldn't quite explain, something familiar yet deeply unsettling. She told herself it was simply empathy for a child who had clearly experienced far too much for her tender age. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. That evening, as Margaret worked in the study, Richard appeared in the doorway. His presence was imposing, though not unkind, as he surveyed the now organized chaos of the room. She glanced up briefly but said nothing, sensing that he wasn't in the mood for small talk. He entered, his hands clasped behind his back, and wandered to the desk where Margaret had carefully arranged his manuscripts. He picked one up, flipping through it absent-mindedly. "You've done a good job," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you," Margaret replied, pausing her task of sorting papers into labeled folders. Richard didn't leave right away. Instead, he stood by the desk, his gaze falling on a framed photograph that Margaret had unearthed and placed there. It was a picture of a young woman, smiling brightly, holding the hand of a little girl. Margaret hadn't asked about it, knowing instinctively that it was deeply personal. "My daughter," Richard said suddenly, his voice low but steady. Her name was Eleanor. Margaret looked up, surprised that he was offering such a vulnerable piece of himself. She remained silent, letting him speak. "She had a way of making everything seem lighter, even when I was buried under deadlines or fighting with publishers. She was remarkable. But I didn't appreciate her enough when I had the chance." There was a long pause before Richard continued. "We had a falling out, Eleanor and I. She wanted to pursue her own path, and I couldn't see past my own stubbornness. She left, and we hardly spoke after that." Margaret's chest tightened as she listened. She could hear the regret woven into his words, the weight of his guilt. But she didn't press him for more. Instead, she simply nodded, offering silent acknowledgement of his pain. Richard left the study soon after, and Margaret returned to her work. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. The next afternoon, during her break, she made her way back to the park near the shelter. Clara was there again, sitting on the same bench, her small frame hunched against the chilly breeze. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Clara," she said gently as she sat beside her. "How are you today?" The girl shrugged, her eyes fixed on the ground. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook and a set of colored pencils she brought along. "I thought you might like these," Margaret said, holding them out to Clara. "You can draw or write, whatever you'd like." Clara hesitated before taking the items, her fingers brushing lightly against Margaret's hand. She opened the notebook and flipped through the blank pages, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at the sight. "Thank you," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. "Of course," Margaret replied. "Do you like to draw?" Clara nodded. "Sometimes. My mom used to draw with me." Margaret's heart clenched. "Your mom sounds wonderful." Clara's expression clouded, and she looked down at the notebook. "She's gone now." Margaret didn't press for details, sensing that the pain was still raw. Instead, she stayed with Clara, offering her quiet companionship as the girl began to draw. By the time Margaret had to leave, Clara had opened up just a little more, sharing snippets of her favorite stories and dreams. Over the next few days, Margaret continued her visits to Clara, each time bringing small gifts or simply sitting with her and listening. She felt a growing connection to the girl, one that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't until she began organizing more of Richard's papers that the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Among the documents Margaret was sorting was a box labeled "Personal." She hesitated before opening it, knowing that Richard had asked her to respect his privacy. But something compelled her to look. Inside, she found photographs, letters, and a worn leather journal. As she flipped through the pages, her breath caught. There were sketches of a young Eleanor, Richard's daughter, along with notes about her life. Margaret's heart pounded as she came across a name she hadn't expected to see: Clara. The journal entries told a fragmented story of Eleanor's life after she left Richard. She had written sporadically to her father, though it seemed he hadn't responded. One entry mentioned Clara by name, describing her as my sweet little girl, who has her grandfather's sharp eyes and stubborn spirit. Margaret's hands trembled as she pieced it together. Clara wasn't just an orphan. She was Richard's granddaughter. The realization hit Margaret like a wave. Clara was the link between Richard and the daughter he had lost. But how could she tell him? How could she reveal this connection without breaking the fragile peace she had begun to build in his home? That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her. She thought of Clara, of her quiet resilience and her dreams of belonging. She thought of Richard, of the pain he carried and the family he didn't even realize he had. And she thought of Eleanor, whose love for both her father and her daughter had somehow survived, even across the chasm of time and loss. Margaret knew what she had to do, but she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. Margaret woke early the next morning, the house quiet except for the faint creaks of the old wooden floors. She couldn't shake the weight of the discovery she'd made. Clara, the sweet little girl she'd met by chance, wasn't just another child in need. She was family, Richard's family. The realization had kept her awake through the night, wrestling with how to tell him. She had no idea how he would react, but she couldn't keep the truth from him for long. She started her day in the study, moving papers mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Her gaze kept drifting to the box she had found the journal in, as if it might offer some guidance on what to do next. She knew Richard wouldn't take kindly to her having opened it in the first place, let alone using its contents to upend his carefully constructed world. Still, the thought of Clara being left alone, without the family she deserved, filled her with determination. Richard appeared later that morning, standing in the doorway as he often did, observing her quietly before speaking. "You're unusually quiet today," he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. Margaret set down the stack of papers she was holding and turned to face him. "I've been thinking, Mr. Alcott, about family." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Family?" "Yes." Margaret hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been sorting through these old papers of yours, and I couldn't help but notice how much you cared for your daughter. Even if things didn't end well between you." Richard's expression darkened, his usual defensiveness surfacing. "What are you getting at?" Margaret took a steadying breath. "I think it's important to hold on to what's left of the people we've loved. Sometimes we get second chances, even if they don't look the way we expect." He frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What are you trying to say, Margaret?" She hesitated, unsure if now was the right time to reveal what she discovered. But before she could decide, Richard waved her off and left the room, muttering something about needing to take a walk. Margaret sighed, sinking into the chair at the desk. It seemed her instincts had been right. Richard wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. Not yet. Later that day, Margaret returned to the park near the shelter, hoping to see Clara. As she approached the bench where they often sat together, she saw the little girl waiting for her, clutching the notebook Margaret had given her. Clara's face lit up when she saw Margaret, a rare smile breaking through her usually solemn expression. "Hi," Clara said shyly, holding up the notebook. "I've been drawing." Margaret sat beside her and flipped through the pages, marveling at the colorful sketches. One drawing in particular caught her eye, a simple but striking depiction of a house that looked remarkably like Richard's mansion. Margaret's breath hitched as she pointed to the picture. "Clara, this house, where did you see it?" Clara tilted her head, thinking. "I don't know. I just dreamed it, I think." Margaret's heart raced. Was it possible that Clara had some faint memory of the place, even though she had never been there? Or was it simply a coincidence? She didn't press further, not wanting to overwhelm the girl. Instead, she tucked the notebook into Clara's bag and suggested they take a short walk. As they strolled along the park's winding paths, Margaret felt a sudden wave of protectiveness toward Clara. The girl deserved so much more than the uncertainty of life in a shelter. She deserved to know where she came from, to be part of a family that could give her love and stability. Margaret thought again of Richard, of his stubbornness and grief, and wondered if he could ever open his heart enough to accept Clara. It seemed impossible, but Margaret wasn't ready to give up. That evening, back at the mansion, Margaret decided to take a risk. She waited until after dinner, when she knew Richard would be sitting in the library with a glass of scotch and a book he wouldn't actually read. She entered quietly, carrying the photograph of Eleanor and the journal she had found. Richard looked up as she approached, his brow furrowing. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the items in her hands. Margaret set the photograph on the table in front of him. "Your daughter," she said simply, "and something she left behind." Richard's expression hardened. "I thought I told you to stay out of my personal things." "I know," Margaret said, her voice steady. "And I'm sorry. But this is important, Richard. It's about Eleanor, and someone she cared about very much." He stiffened at her words, his gaze flickering to the journal. For a long moment, he said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Go on." Margaret hesitated, her heart pounding. She opened the journal to the entry that mentioned Clara and slid it across the table to him. Richard stared at the page, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something Margaret couldn't quite name. Something raw and vulnerable. "Clara," he murmured, the name barely audible. "Yes," Margaret said softly. "She's your granddaughter, Richard. Eleanor's daughter." For a moment, the room was silent except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Richard sat frozen, the journal still open in his hands. Margaret held her breath, waiting for his reaction. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret exhaled, relief washing over her. "She's nearby. I've been spending time with her. She's a wonderful little girl, Richard, and she needs you." Richard sat in silence, his hands gripping the edges of the journal as if it might slip away. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the lines etched deeply into his skin. Margaret waited, unsure of what he might say or do next. She had prepared herself for anger, for denial, for an outburst that might send her from the room. But instead, there was only a quiet, heavy stillness. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "A few days," she admitted. "I wasn't looking for it, Richard. It was in your papers. Once I realized the connection, I couldn't ignore it." He stared down at the journal, his eyes fixed on Eleanor's delicate handwriting. "And you've seen her? Clara?" "Yes," Margaret said softly. "I met her at a shelter. She's a bright, sweet child. She reminds me of Eleanor in some ways." Richard's grip on the journal tightened. "You don't know Eleanor?" he said sharply, though his voice lacked the force to make it a true accusation. "I know her through your memories," Margaret replied, her tone gentle but firm. "And through her words. She wrote about Clara, Richard. She wanted her to know where she came from, even if she couldn't give her that herself." Richard's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked impossibly tired. The weight of the years, the mistakes, and the loss seemed to press down on him all at once. He closed the journal carefully and set it on the table. His hand lingered on the worn leather cover, as if it might offer some comfort. "Why didn't she come back?" he asked, more to himself than to Margaret. "Why didn't she tell me?" Margaret hesitated. "I think maybe she didn't think you'd listen. Maybe she thought it was too late." Richard flinched, the words striking deep. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. His silhouette against the firelight was imposing, but Margaret could see the vulnerability in the slump of his shoulders. "I failed her," he said after a long silence. "I failed Eleanor, and now there's this child, this granddaughter I didn't even know I had. What kind of man does that make me?" Margaret rose from her chair and approached him cautiously. "A man who has a chance to make things right," she said. "Clara needs you, Richard. She's alone in the world. You're all she has." He turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "What if she doesn't want me? What if it's too late for her to?" "It's not," Margaret said firmly. "Children have an incredible capacity for love and forgiveness, Richard. But only if you give them the chance." He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or strength. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I want to see her." Margaret felt a surge of relief and hope. "I can take you to the shelter tomorrow." Richard's jaw tightened, and he nodded again, more resolutely this time. Tomorrow, then. The next day dawned cold and gray, the kind of Vermont morning that hinted at snow in the air. Richard seemed more somber than usual, his movements deliberate as he prepared for the trip. Margaret could sense his nerves, though he didn't speak of them. He spent much of the morning pacing the study, his eyes lingering on the photograph of Eleanor that Margaret had placed on his desk. When they arrived at the shelter, Richard hesitated at the entrance, his hand hovering over the door handle. Margaret placed a steadying hand on his arm. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and pushed the door open. Inside, the shelter was warm and bustling with activity. Children played in a corner, their laughter ringing through the air. Margaret scanned the room and spotted Clara sitting at a small table, coloring quietly. Her heart squeezed at the sight of the little girl who had come to mean so much to her. "There she is," Margaret whispered, nodding toward Clara. Richard's eyes followed her gaze, and he froze. For a moment, he simply stared, taking in the sight of the child who, despite everything, carried a piece of Eleanor with her. His grip on Margaret's arm tightened slightly, as though he needed the support to keep himself steady. "She's small," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled faintly. "She's strong." Clara looked up from her coloring and noticed them standing by the door. Her eyes met Margaret's, and a smile spread across her face. Then she saw Richard, and her expression turned curious but not frightened. Margaret took a step forward, beckoning to Clara. "Come here, sweetheart," she said gently. Clara stood and walked over, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes flicking between Margaret and Richard. "Clara," Margaret said, crouching to her level, "this is Mr. Alcott. He's a friend of mine. He wanted to meet you." Clara's gaze settled on Richard, her head tilting slightly. "Hello," she said softly. Richard opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. Instead, he crouched down slowly, his knees creaking, until he was eye level with her. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was your mother's. She wrote it about you." Clara hesitated, then reached out and took the paper. She unfolded it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. Margaret watched as Richard's face softened, his walls beginning to crumble. In that moment, she knew they were taking the first step toward something neither of them had thought possible, a family. Clara's small hands unfolded the paper with careful precision, her eyes scanning the neat, looping handwriting. Richard remained crouched before her, his breath shallow as he watched her read. Margaret stood slightly behind them, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and apprehension. The room around them seemed to fall silent, the hum of activity fading as this fragile moment unfolded. Clara's lips moved slightly as she read to herself, her expression softening. She looked up, her wide, dark eyes meeting Richard's. "Did my mommy write this?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Yes," he said. "She wrote it about you. She loved you very much." Clara stared at him for a long moment, as though trying to gauge the truth in his words. Then, with the paper still in her hand, she asked the question Margaret had feared but knew would come. "How do you know my mommy?" Richard froze. The weight of the question seemed to paralyze him. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, trembled slightly. Margaret stepped forward, crouching beside Clara, and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Clara," she said softly, "Mr. Alcott knew your mommy because she was his daughter." Clara's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across her face. "His daughter? But that means—" Her voice trailed off as realization began to dawn on her. Margaret nodded, her voice soothing. "That means Mr. Alcott is your grandfather." Clara's gaze shifted back to Richard, her expression a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he nodded slowly. "It's true," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your grandfather, Clara." The room seemed to hold its breath as Clara processed this revelation. She looked down at the letter in her hands, then back up at Richard. "You're my mommy's daddy?" "Yes," Richard said. "I didn't know about you until now, but I'm here. I'm here for you." Clara's small fingers tightened around the paper as she tilted her head slightly. "You didn't know about me?" "No," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I wish I had. If I had known, I would have come for you sooner." Clara's expression softened slightly, though her brow remained furrowed. "Mommy didn't talk about you," she said, almost as though she were testing him. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the pain of her words hitting him like a blow. "She and we had a hard time, Clara. We didn't always get along, and that's my fault. But I loved her. I loved her very much." Clara seemed to consider this for a moment before asking, "Do you love me?" Margaret's breath caught, her heart aching at the raw vulnerability in Clara's voice. Richard's eyes widened, and a tear slipped down his cheek. "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes, Clara, I love you. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I love you with all my heart." Clara studied him, her expression thoughtful. Then, slowly, she took a small step forward. Richard remained perfectly still, not wanting to startle her. Clara reached out and touched his hand, her small fingers brushing against his. The simple gesture seemed to break the dam of tension in the room. Richard let out a shaky breath and gently took her hand in his, holding it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "I don't want to stay at the shelter," Clara said softly. "I don't like it there." Richard nodded, his voice steady now. "You won't have to. You can come home with me, if that's what you want." Clara's eyes widened. "To your big house?" "Yes," he said, a faint smile breaking through his tears. "To my big house. It's not much of a home right now, but maybe you can help me make it one." Clara looked at Margaret, seeking reassurance. Margaret smiled warmly, her voice gentle. "It's okay, Clara. You'll be safe with him. He just wants to take care of you." After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded. "Okay." Richard's shoulders sagged with relief. He reached out and gently pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her small frame as though he were afraid she might disappear. Clara hesitated for a moment before hugging him back, her little arms tightening around his neck. Margaret watched the scene unfold, her chest tight with emotion. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing she had helped bring them together. But she also felt a pang of sadness, knowing how much pain Richard had endured to reach this point and how much more lay ahead as he navigated this new chapter. When they finally pulled apart, Richard looked at Margaret, his gratitude clear in his tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, her own eyes damp. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You'll both need time, but you've found each other. That's what matters." Richard nodded, his hand resting protectively on Clara's shoulder. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I won't fail her." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with hope. In that moment, she believed him. As they left the shelter together, Clara holding tightly to both Richard's and Margaret's hands, it was as if the world outside had softened. The cold air no longer felt so harsh, and the gray skies seemed just a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt the stirrings of something he had thought lost forever: hope. The drive back to Richard's mansion was quiet. Clara sat in the back seat, her small frame bundled in the oversized coat Margaret had borrowed from the shelter. She held the folded letter from her mother tightly in her hands, as though it might vanish if she let it go. Margaret glanced at her through the rearview mirror occasionally, her heart aching at the mix of curiosity and apprehension she saw in the little girl's eyes. Richard sat beside her in the passenger seat, his hands clasped together in his lap. He stared out the window, his thoughts seemingly miles away. Margaret could sense his nervousness, the uncertainty of stepping into a role he'd never imagined for himself. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a determination, a flicker of resolve she hadn't seen in him before. When they arrived at the mansion, Clara's eyes widened at the sight of the sprawling house. She peered out the window, her nose nearly pressed to the glass, as Margaret parked the car. "This is your house?" Clara asked, her voice small but filled with wonder. "It's ours now," Richard replied, his voice soft but steady. He stepped out of the car and opened the back door for Clara. She hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, her grip tentative but trusting. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, the long hallways and high ceilings amplifying the silence. Margaret hurried ahead, turning on lights and adjusting the thermostat. Clara stayed close to Richard, her wide eyes taking in the grand staircase, the ornate furniture, and the towering bookshelves. It was clear she had never seen anything like it before. "This place is huge," Clara whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the entryway. "It is," Richard admitted. "Maybe too big for just the two of us. But I think we'll manage." Margaret reappeared, her smile warm. "How about we find a room for Clara? Somewhere cozy." Clara nodded eagerly, and the three of them made their way upstairs. Margaret led the way, opening doors and peeking inside until she found a smaller bedroom at the end of the hall. It had soft blue walls, a window that overlooked the garden, and a simple bed with a quilted blanket. It wasn't as grand as the other rooms, but it felt welcoming. "This one?" Margaret asked, turning to Clara. Clara stepped inside, looking around with wide eyes. She set the letter down carefully on the bedside table and ran her hand over the blanket. "It's nice," she said quietly. Richard stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. "If there's anything you want to change, we can," he offered. "It's your room now." Clara shook her head. "I like it." Margaret busied herself, opening drawers and making mental notes of what Clara might need. Clothes, books, toys. Richard stayed rooted in place, watching Clara as she explored the room. There was something fragile about the moment, as though neither of them quite knew how to move forward. But there was also a quiet sense of possibility. That evening, Margaret cooked a simple dinner while Clara sat at the kitchen table, drawing in her notebook. Richard lingered nearby, unsure of how to engage, but unwilling to leave her alone. Occasionally, he would glance over her shoulder and murmur a quiet compliment about her drawings. Clara would respond with a shy smile, her walls beginning to lower little by little. Margaret watched them from the stove, her chest tight with emotion. She had seen Richard at his lowest, gruff, withdrawn, and haunted by his past. Now, she saw glimpses of the man he could become, the man he wanted to be for Clara. It wasn't an easy transformation, but it was happening, piece by piece. After dinner, Clara yawned and rubbed her eyes, the long day finally catching up to her. Margaret led her upstairs and helped her settle into bed, tucking the quilt around her small frame. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's face. Clara nodded, clutching the letter from her mother close to her chest. "I think so," she whispered. "I miss my mommy, though." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice gentle, "and it's okay to miss her. She loved you so much. That love will always be with you." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Do you think she's watching me?" Margaret smiled, her own eyes misting. "I do. And I think she's very proud of you." Clara sniffled and closed her eyes, holding the letter tightly. Margaret stayed by her side until her breathing slowed and she drifted off to sleep. When Margaret returned downstairs, she found Richard sitting in the library, a glass of scotch untouched on the table in front of him. "She's asleep," Margaret said, sitting in the chair across from him. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted after a long pause. "I don't know how to be what she needs." "You already are," Margaret said firmly. "You're here. You're trying. That's more than enough for now." Richard looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed. "I failed Eleanor. I don't want to fail Clara, too." "You won't," Margaret said. "You're different now, Richard. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "I'll try." "That's all anyone can ask," Margaret said, her voice soft but resolute. As the night deepened, the house felt a little less empty, the silence a little less heavy. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for redemption and love in his life. The following days brought a rhythm of cautious adjustment for Clara, Richard, and Margaret. The mansion, once quiet and cold, began to take on a new energy, subtly changing with the presence of a child. Clara moved through the halls with tentative curiosity, her small footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Margaret made it her mission to create a sense of normalcy for the girl, ensuring she felt not just welcomed but wanted. Richard, meanwhile, found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had spent so long isolating himself from the world that Clara's presence felt both invigorating and unsettling. Each morning, he would join her at the breakfast table, carefully navigating the conversations Margaret gently encouraged. Clara would answer his questions with short, polite responses, her shyness slowly giving way to cautious trust. One morning, as Richard poured himself a cup of coffee, Clara surprised him. "Do you write books?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Richard froze for a moment before setting the pot down. "I do," he said, turning to her. "At least I used to." Clara tilted her head. "Why don't you anymore?" The question caught him off guard, and he glanced at Margaret, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. He sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. "I stopped because I didn't feel like I had anything to say." Clara frowned slightly. "But you wrote a lot before, right? So maybe you just need to think of a new story." Richard blinked at her, surprised by the simplicity of her suggestion. "Maybe," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. From that point on, their conversations grew a little easier. Clara began asking him about the books he'd written, and Richard, despite his initial hesitation, found himself sharing stories about the worlds he had created. There was a spark in her eyes when he described far-off lands and brave heroes, a spark that reminded him of Eleanor as a child. It stirred something within him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Margaret cleaned up after dinner, Richard and Clara sat in the library. Clara had her notebook open, sketching something while Richard read silently from an old book. Every so often, she would glance at him, as if gauging whether it was okay to speak. "What are you drawing?" Richard asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Clara hesitated before turning the notebook toward him. "It's our house," she said. The drawing was simple but filled with small, thoughtful details. The tall windows, the staircase, the garden she had seen from her bedroom window. Richard studied it for a long moment, his throat tightening. "You have quite the eye for detail," he said. "It's very good." Clara smiled, her cheeks flushing with pride. "Thanks." Margaret watched them from the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. She had worried about how Richard would adapt to his new role, but seeing him with Clara now, she knew she had made the right decision in bringing them together. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to settle into her new life. Margaret took her into town to buy clothes and toys, ensuring she had everything she needed to feel at home. Richard even ventured out with them on occasion, though his discomfort in crowds was evident. Still, Clara seemed to appreciate his presence, and Margaret noticed how she would glance at him for reassurance. One afternoon, they stopped at a small bookstore. Clara wandered through the children's section, her eyes lighting up at the colorful covers. Margaret nudged Richard gently. "Let her pick a few," she said. "It'll be good for her." Richard nodded, watching as Clara carefully selected 3 books and brought them to the counter. When they returned home, she immediately curled up in her new favorite spot by the library window and began reading. Richard sat nearby, pretending to read his own book but secretly stealing glances at her. The sight of her engrossed in the pages filled him with a quiet joy. But not everything was seamless. Clara still had moments of sadness, especially at night when the weight of her loss seemed to settle in. Margaret often found her clutching the letter from her mother, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. On those nights, Margaret would sit with her, holding her hand and reminding her that it was okay to feel sad, that she wasn't alone. Richard, too, struggled with his own doubts. He often questioned whether he was capable of being the grandfather Clara needed, whether he could fill even a small part of the void left by Eleanor. Margaret became his anchor during these moments, offering quiet encouragement and reminding him of the progress they had made. One night, as they sat in the study after Clara had gone to bed, Richard broke the silence. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me for not being there sooner?" Margaret looked at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "She doesn't need to forgive you, Richard. She just needs to know you're here now. That's what matters to her. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I want to do right by her. I just don't know if I can. You already are, Margaret said. Every day, you're showing her that she matters. That's more than enough. As winter settled in, the mansion began to feel less like a relic of the past and more like a home. Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, warming spaces that had once felt empty. Richard found himself looking forward to their time together, cherishing the small moments that made up their new life. And Margaret, though still cautious, began to see the beginnings of a family forming before her eyes. Richard often thought of Eleanor, of the pain and mistakes that had driven them apart. But now, with Clara in his life, he felt a glimmer of redemption. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor Eleanor's memory by being the grandfather Clara needed. Slowly but surely, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful out of the broken pieces. The snow arrived in a soft flurry one morning, blanketing the grounds of the mansion in pristine white. Clara's excitement was immediate and infectious. She pressed her small hands against the frosted window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the endless stretch of shimmering snow. "Can I go outside?" she asked, her voice bright with anticipation. Richard, standing behind her with his coffee, hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course," he said, "but bundle up. It's cold." Margaret quickly found a warm coat and scarf for Clara, making sure she had gloves and boots that fit. The three of them stepped outside together, the air crisp and biting. Clara ran ahead, leaving a trail of small footprints as she kicked up snow and laughed. Richard watched her, a smile tugging at his lips. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen a child so genuinely happy. The sound of her laughter stirred something deep within him, a warmth that pushed back against the cold weight of his grief. Clara's joyful exploration soon turned into a request. "Can we make a snowman?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Richard hesitated, glancing at Margaret. She smiled encouragingly. "I think that's a great idea," he nodded, setting his coffee down on the porch and stepping into the snow beside Clara. Together, they began to roll large balls of snow, stacking them carefully to form the body of the snowman. Margaret joined in, adding small details like buttons made of pebbles and a scarf borrowed from Richard. When they finished, Clara stood back, beaming with pride. "He's perfect," she declared. Richard crouched beside her, brushing the snow off his gloves. "Not bad," he agreed, his tone light. "What should we call him?" Clara tilted her head, thinking for a moment. "Henry," she decided with certainty. "Henry it is," Richard said, his smile widening. They spent the rest of the morning outside, throwing snowballs and making snow angels. Richard found himself laughing more than he had in years, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. Margaret watched the two of them, her heart swelling with gratitude. Seeing Richard and Clara connect so naturally was a reminder of why she had fought so hard to bring them together. Later that afternoon, as the three of them warmed up inside with mugs of hot chocolate, Clara leaned her head against Richard's arm. It was a small gesture, but one that carried immense weight. Richard looked down at her, his expression softening as he rested his hand gently on her shoulder. The days that followed continued to strengthen the bond between them. Richard began to spend more time with Clara, reading to her from his old books and even helping her with her drawings. One evening, he surprised both Clara and Margaret by pulling out an old typewriter and setting it on the dining room table. "I thought we could write a story together," he said, addressing Clara. "You draw the pictures and I'll type the words." Clara's face lit up with excitement. "Really? Really?" Richard said, his voice warm. "But only if you want to." Clara nodded eagerly. "I want to." Margaret watched as they worked on their story, the two of them huddled around the typewriter. Clara described fantastical characters and adventures, while Richard typed her words with careful precision. It was a sight that filled Margaret with hope, a reminder of how far they had all come. But even as their days were filled with small joys, there were still moments of sadness. Clara occasionally woke up crying, her dreams haunted by memories of her mother. On those nights, Richard would sit by her bed, speaking to her in a low, comforting voice until she fell back asleep. It wasn't easy for him. Facing her pain often mirrored his own, but he refused to let her face it alone. One evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Richard and Margaret sat together in the library. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. Richard stared into the flames, his expression pensive. "She's been through so much," he said quietly. "More than any child should." "She's resilient," Margaret replied. "But she needs you, Richard, and you're giving her exactly what she needs." He nodded slowly, but his brow remained furrowed. "Sometimes I wonder if Eleanor would be proud of me. If she'd think I'm doing enough for Clara." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Eleanor would be proud," she said. "She'd be proud of the man you've become, the grandfather you're learning to be. Clara is proof of that." Richard met her gaze, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I hope you're right." Margaret smiled. "I know I'm right." As winter deepened, the mansion began to feel more alive than it had in years. Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, filling the empty spaces with warmth and light. Richard found himself looking forward to each new day, cherishing the moments they shared together. And Margaret, though she tried to keep her role as caretaker and mediator, couldn't deny the growing bond she felt with both of them. One evening, as the three of them sat around the dining room table finishing dinner, Clara looked up at Richard with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Mommy is happy now?" she asked. Richard's breath caught, and he glanced at Margaret before answering. "I think she is," he said, his voice steady. "I think she's happy because she knows you're safe and loved." Clara smiled faintly. "I hope so." Richard reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. "She would be so proud of you, Clara, just like I am." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded, her grip tightening around his hand. Margaret watched them, her heart swelling with both sorrow and joy. In that moment, it felt as though they had all found a piece of what they had been searching for, a sense of belonging, of family, of hope. The days blended into one another as the snow deepened, turning the estate into a winter wonderland. Clara seemed to thrive in the newfound stability, her laughter becoming a regular melody in the house. Richard found himself more attuned to her needs, anticipating the small things. A warm cup of cocoa after an afternoon outside, a favorite story read aloud before bed. The routines that once seemed so alien to him now felt natural. Margaret, observing their growing bond, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Yet, there was a part of her that worried about the fragility of it all. Richard had come a long way, but his past still loomed like a shadow. She knew he carried guilt over his estranged relationship with Eleanor, and though he was trying his best with Clara, there were moments when his self-doubt would resurface. One such moment came late one evening after Clara had gone to bed. Margaret found Richard sitting alone in the study, a glass of scotch untouched on the table beside him. His gaze was fixed on a photograph of Eleanor, her bright smile forever frozen in time. "She was always so full of life," Richard said when he noticed Margaret standing in the doorway. "Even as a little girl, she had this energy, like the world couldn't contain her." Margaret stepped into the room, taking a seat across from him. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Richard said, his voice heavy, "and I drove her away. I thought I was protecting her, but I was just being selfish. I couldn't see that she needed to make her own choices." Margaret leaned forward, her expression gentle. "You made mistakes, Richard. We all do. But what you're doing for Clara now, it matters. You're showing up for her. That's what she'll remember." Richard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I just hope it's enough. I don't want her to grow up feeling like she doesn't belong." Margaret reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Clara belongs here, with you, and she knows that." Richard gave a small nod, though his eyes remained clouded with doubt. "I just wish Eleanor were here to see this, to see how amazing Clara is." Margaret smiled softly. "In a way, I think she is." The conversation stayed with Richard, and the following morning, he made an effort to involve Clara in something he hadn't done in years, writing. He set up the old typewriter at the kitchen table and invited Clara to sit with him. She was hesitant at first, unsure of what he expected her to do, but Richard encouraged her to share a story from her imagination. Anything you want, he said. There are no wrong ideas. Clara's face lit up as she began describing a tale about a brave little girl who explored a magical forest. Richard typed her words with careful precision, asking questions that encouraged her to expand on her ideas. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart swelling as she saw how naturally the two of them worked together. When they finished the first few pages, Clara clapped her hands excitedly. Can we write more tomorrow? Richard smiled. Of course. This is your story. We'll write it as long as you want. The activity became a daily ritual, one that seemed to bring both of them immense joy. Clara's confidence grew with each passing day, her stories becoming more elaborate and filled with vibrant details. For Richard, the act of writing again, this time with Clara, felt like a kind of healing. He was reconnecting with a part of himself he thought he had lost, and in doing so, he was also strengthening his bond with his granddaughter. As the weeks went on, Richard began to notice changes in himself. The bitterness he had carried for so long seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to be the man Clara needed. He no longer avoided the reminders of Eleanor, instead finding comfort in the ways Clara reflected her mother's spirit. It wasn't a complete transformation. There were still moments of doubt, of grief, but he was learning to carry those feelings without letting them define him. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, Clara turned to Richard with a thoughtful expression. "Grandpa, do you think I can write stories like you when I grow up?" Richard's heart swelled at the word grandpa, a title he hadn't expected to mean so much. He smiled warmly. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, Clara." Clara beamed, her eyes shining with pride. "Maybe I can write stories about Mommy, so people can know how special she was." Richard's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Your mommy was very special, and you have her same big heart." Clara leaned against him, her small frame warm and solid. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of peace. The wounds of the past hadn't completely healed, but they were no longer raw. He had found purpose in caring for Clara, and she, in turn, had brought light back into his life. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside, the three of them sat together in the library. Clara worked on her drawings, Richard read aloud from one of his old books, and Margaret watched them with quiet contentment. The mansion, once so filled with silence and sorrow, now felt alive with love and possibility. Richard glanced at Margaret, his eyes meeting hers with unspoken gratitude. She had been the one to bring Clara into his life, to push him toward redemption when he had been too afraid to seek it himself. He knew he owed her more than he could ever express. As Clara's eyelids began to droop, Margaret gathered her up and carried her to bed. Richard followed, tucking her in and pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Clara mumbled something incoherent, already half asleep, but her small hand found his and held it tightly. For Richard, it was enough. In that moment, he realized that the love he had lost was not gone. It had simply changed form, finding its way back to him through Clara. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a happy ending. The first signs of spring began to show as the snow melted, leaving the grounds around the mansion soft and damp with the promise of renewal. Clara spent her mornings exploring the garden, now sprouting tiny green shoots where flowers would soon bloom. Richard often watched her from the window of his study, a quiet smile on his face as he took in the sight of her newfound joy. He had come to cherish these simple moments, the ones where life felt full and unbroken. Margaret, ever the steady presence, had begun making plans for Clara's future. Together, she and Richard discussed schooling, activities, and ways to ensure Clara felt secure and supported. Though the logistics of raising a child were unfamiliar to him, Richard embraced the responsibility with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was as though Clara's arrival had reignited something within him, a long-dormant ability to dream of a life beyond the confines of his grief. One afternoon, Clara approached Richard in the library with her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Grandpa," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness, "I finished our story." Richard set his glasses down and smiled. "You did? Let's hear it." Clara climbed onto the chair beside him, flipping open the notebook to reveal her colorful illustrations accompanying the words they had written together. Her voice was clear and confident as she read aloud the tale of a brave girl who ventured into a magical forest to find a lost treasure. Richard listened intently, his heart swelling with pride at her creativity and determination. When she finished, Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Do you think it's good?" "It's better than good," Richard said, his voice warm. "It's wonderful. I think you might be a writer someday." Clara's smile was radiant. "Like you?" Richard nodded. "Like me, and even better." As the days grew longer, the three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm. Clara's laughter became a constant presence in the house, filling the once empty rooms with warmth and light. Richard found himself seeking out her company more and more, whether it was helping her with her drawings, playing board games in the evenings, or simply sitting together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. One evening, as Margaret and Richard shared a quiet moment in the kitchen after Clara had gone to bed, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You've given me back more than I ever thought possible," he said. "I don't know how to thank you." Margaret smiled, her eyes kind. "You don't need to thank me, Richard. You've done the hard work, opening your heart again. Clara's life is better because of you." He shook his head. "She's better because of us. You've been just as important to her as I have." Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "I've grown to love her," she admitted. "And you?" Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. The gesture was simple but carried a depth of emotion that neither of them could put into words. They stayed like that for a moment, the silence between them filled with an unspoken understanding. The following weekend, Richard decided to take Clara into town for a special outing. He wanted to show her the world beyond the mansion, to let her experience the community and see that she had a place in it. They visited the local park, where Clara played with other children, her laughter ringing out as she chased after a bright red kite. Richard watched her from a bench, his heart full as he marveled at how far she had come. When they returned home that evening, Clara presented him with a small drawing she had made while sitting under a tree at the park. It depicted the three of them, Clara, Richard, and Margaret, standing together in front of the mansion, their hands linked. Above them, a bright yellow sun shone down, casting everything in a warm glow. "This is us," Clara said proudly as she handed him the picture. Richard studied the drawing, his throat tightening. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you." Clara beamed. "Do you think Mommy would like it?" "I think she'd love it," Richard said, pulling her into a gentle hug. "And I think she'd be very proud of you." That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Richard carefully framed the drawing and placed it on the mantel in the living room. It was a small act, but one that felt deeply significant. It was a symbol of the new life they were building together, a testament to the love that had grown out of loss. In the weeks that followed, Richard continued to embrace his role as Clara's grandfather. He enrolled her in a local school, where she quickly made friends and began to thrive. Margaret remained a constant presence, supporting both of them with her steady guidance and unwavering kindness. The mansion, once a place of solitude and sorrow, had transformed into a home filled with love and laughter. On a particularly warm spring afternoon, as the garden bloomed with vibrant colors, Richard sat on the porch with Clara and Margaret. They sipped lemonade and shared stories, the air alive with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of peace that went beyond mere contentment. It was a deep, abiding joy that came from knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun began to set, Clara leaned her head against his arm, her small hand resting on his. "I love you, Grandpa," she said softly. Richard's throat tightened, and he blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. "I love you too, Clara," he replied, his voice steady. Margaret smiled at them, her heart full as she watched the two of them together. In that moment, she knew that despite the pain and loss they had all endured, they had found something rare and beautiful, a second chance at love, family, and the life they all deserved. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden light, Richard knew that his story wasn't just one of redemption, it was one of hope. Together, they had rewritten the ending, creating a new beginning filled with endless possibilities. The years passed gently, bringing a rhythm to life that felt both steady and full. The mansion, once a somber monument to Richard's grief, had become a place of joy and shared memories. Clara grew taller, her once childish giggles evolving into a confident laugh that echoed through the halls. The house was no longer quiet. It was alive with her energy and the warmth of a family rebuilt. Richard sat at his desk in the study one sunny afternoon, his hands poised over the keyboard of a sleek, new laptop. Clara had convinced him to trade his beloved typewriter for something modern, though he often muttered about missing the clack of the keys. Today, though, he hardly noticed the difference. He was deep into the final chapters of a novel he had once thought he'd never write. This story was different. It wasn't an escape into fantasy or a reimagining of life. It was real, drawn from his own heart and the journey he had taken with Clara and Margaret. As he typed, he paused often, staring out the window at the garden, where Clara and Margaret were planting flowers. Margaret had tied her hair back with a scarf, and Clara was chattering away as she worked, her hands covered in dirt. Richard smiled, the sight filling him with a quiet happiness he had once thought impossible. He finished the chapter and leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts drift. He thought of Eleanor, of the years they had lost, and of the life she had lived apart from him. He would never stop regretting the distance between them, but he had found solace in Clara, in the way she carried her mother's spirit forward. Through her, he had discovered that love could grow even in the shadow of loss. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie, and Clara appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the sun. "Grandpa," she said, holding up a small bouquet of flowers. "We picked these for you." Richard stood, walking over to take the flowers from her hands. "They're beautiful," he said. "Thank you, sweetheart." Clara grinned. "Margaret says we should put them in the library. It's too quiet in there without something pretty." Richard chuckled. "She's right. Let's find a vase." As they walked to the kitchen together, Richard felt a familiar tug of gratitude. Margaret joined them a moment later, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile as warm as the spring sunlight streaming through the windows. They arranged the flowers in a vase and carried them to the library, where they sat together, talking and laughing as the afternoon light faded into evening. Richard's novel would be finished soon, and he knew it would find a home on the shelves of readers who, like him, had once believed their stories were over. But more importantly, he knew that his own story had found its perfect ending, not in the pages of a book, but in the love and life he had rebuilt with Clara and Margaret by his side.